For as long as complex societies have organized themselves around money, the same quiet transformation has repeated. It does not arrive with fire or banners. It begins with ledgers, with adjustments, with rules that are technically correct, legally sound, and calmly explained. Wealth, once assumed to be private and secure, is slowly redefined as something conditional. Not taken outright, but repurposed, reclassified, absorbed into the system that claims it must survive at all costs. This pattern appears in empires separated by centuries and cultures. In ancient city-states where citizens deposited grain in public storehouses only to discover during crisis that ownership had become a suggestion. In medieval banking hubs where deposits were frozen, converted, or delayed indefinitely to preserve institutional solvency. In early modern states where paper claims replaced metal and promises quietly replaced possession. Each time, the language was orderly. Each time, the justification was stability. And each time, depositors learned the same lesson too late. Money inside the system does not belong to you in the way money outside the system does. The transition is never announced as confiscation. It is framed as resolution, as protection, as a necessary mechanism to prevent something worse. The public is told that without intervention, the collapse would be catastrophic, that shared sacrifice is preferable to disorder, that temporary measures will restore long-term confidence. And for a while, this appears to work. Markets reopen, institutions survive, daily life continues. But the ownership line has already been crossed. History shows that when financial systems grow large enough, interconnected enough, and indebted enough, they eventually reach a point where losses cannot be absorbed by capital alone. Someone must bear them. When governments cannot raise taxes fast enough and central banks cannot print credibility, the burden shifts quietly to where the money already sits. Deposits become a resource, a buffer, a stabilizing force. Not because depositors agreed, but because the system requires it. This is not driven by malice. It is driven by arithmetic, by balance sheets that must balance, by legal frameworks designed in advance for moments of stress, by emergency powers written long before emergencies arrive. The people affected rarely see it coming because nothing appears to change until it does. Their account balances remain visible. Their statements still arrive. But the nature of what those numbers represent has been altered. Every cycle ends the same way. Ownership becomes participation, savings become instruments, security becomes exposure, and the public looking back realizes that the moment of loss was not loud or dramatic. It was procedural. That moment is never recognized as history while it is happening. It only becomes obvious afterward when the old assumptions no longer apply and the system insists it was always this way. Large-scale systemic collapse rarely looks like collapse while it is unfolding. It looks like management, like policy responses, like carefully calibrated interventions designed to smooth volatility and restore confidence. In reality, collapse begins not with chaos, but with continuity. Institutions remain open, transactions continue to clear, laws are enforced. What changes first is not the surface, but the structure beneath it. Historically, collapse unfolds as a progression. The early stages are marked by expansion and success. Productivity rises, trade increases, financial systems deepen, credit becomes more accessible, and leverage is celebrated as efficiency. This phase builds the illusion of permanence. Growth appears self-sustaining, and risk is believed to be distributed rather than concentrated. The next stage arrives quietly, as debt begins to grow faster than underlying productivity. Returns are increasingly generated not from creation, but from financial engineering. Consumption accelerates while discipline erodes. To maintain momentum, systems rely more heavily on borrowing against the future. This is not immediately visible to the public because living standards continue to rise and asset prices inflate in ways that feel like prosperity. As imbalances deepen, the third stage emerges: distortion. Interest rates are suppressed to service mounting debt. Incentives shift from long-term resilience to short-term stability. Capital flows toward speculation rather than production. Institutions that should fail are preserved to avoid disruption. Losses are delayed, not eliminated. The system grows more fragile precisely because it appears calm. The fourth stage is normalization of risk. Behaviors that would once have been unthinkable become standard practice. Emergency measures are rebranded as tools. Temporary programs are extended indefinitely. The language of crisis fades, even as the underlying stress increases. This is the phase where confidence is maintained through narrative rather than fundamentals. Eventually, the system reaches a point where shocks can no longer be absorbed internally. This is the fifth stage: transfer. Losses are shifted away from institutions deemed too important to fail and onto parties with less power to resist. Contracts are reinterpreted, rules are amended, ownership is redefined. This stage is often legal, orderly, and deeply misunderstood by the public. The final stage is recognition, but it comes too late to alter the outcome. Trust erodes not because a single event occurs, but because people realize the system no longer operates under the assumptions they relied on. Capital flees where it can. Participation declines where it cannot. What follows is not always immediate collapse, but a prolonged period of stagnation, fragmentation, and diminished confidence. This sequence repeats because it is rooted in incentives. No individual actor intends to destroy the system. Each decision, taken in isolation, appears rational. But together, they form a trajectory that has been traced across centuries. Collapse is not an accident. It is a process. And once it enters the later stages, reversal becomes structurally impossible. One of the clearest historical illustrations of this process unfolded not in a moment of dramatic conquest or sudden defeat, but over generations within the Roman Empire. At its height, Rome possessed structural advantages unmatched in the ancient world. Its roads enabled trade across continents. Its legal system standardized contracts. Its military secured borders that allowed commerce to flow with minimal disruption. For centuries, wealth moved efficiently through the empire, reinforcing the belief that Roman dominance was not merely powerful, but permanent. In its early expansion, Rome's economic strength was rooted in productivity. Conquest brought resources, labor, and tribute. Agricultural output increased. Trade networks expanded. Coinage was trusted because it was consistent. Fiscal discipline, while imperfect, existed within cultural norms that valued restraint and civic duty. The system functioned because expansion funded obligations. But over time, the nature of Rome's economy shifted. As territorial expansion slowed, the inflow of new resources declined. Obligations, however, did not. Maintaining legions, administering distant provinces, and subsidizing urban populations became increasingly expensive. Rather than reduce commitments, Roman leadership turned to monetary solutions. Coinage was gradually debased, reducing silver content while maintaining face value. On paper, nothing changed. In reality, purchasing power eroded. This debasement allowed the state to meet immediate obligations, but it distorted incentives throughout the economy. Prices rose unevenly. Productive activity declined as trust in currency weakened. Wealth flowed through the system faster, but it did not remain. Those closest to power benefited first, while the broader population bore the long-term cost through inflation and scarcity. As productivity fell, consumption did not. Urban populations grew dependent on state distributions of grain and goods. Military expenditures expanded, even as revenue reliability deteriorated. To compensate, taxes increased, often enforced through increasingly coercive means. Small landholders were squeezed, absorbed by large estates, or abandoned altogether. Economic participation narrowed. The social consequences were profound. A shrinking tax base supported a growing administrative and military apparatus. The economy became less flexible, more brittle. Trade networks frayed. Local self-sufficiency replaced imperial integration. By the time external pressures intensified, the internal system had already lost cohesion. Rome did not collapse because wealth disappeared. It collapsed because wealth stopped circulating in ways that sustained the system. Resources were extracted, redirected, and consumed without being replenished. Confidence in money eroded before confidence in governance. By the end, the empire still existed in name, but its economic foundation had hollowed out. The lesson is not that Rome fell suddenly, but that it adapted itself into fragility. Each monetary adjustment solved a short-term problem while deepening a long-term one. The system survived longer than expected, which only reinforced the belief that it always would. A similar conviction shaped the trajectory of another system centuries later, one that believed its sophistication made it immune to ancient patterns. In early modern Europe, the Spanish Empire stood at the center of a global economic network, unlike anything the world had seen. Vast quantities of silver flowed from the Americas into Spanish vaults. Trade routes stretched across oceans. The crown commanded resources that appeared inexhaustible. To contemporaries, Spain was not merely wealthy, it was structurally invincible. This abundance produced a powerful assumption that access to wealth was equivalent to the capacity to sustain it. Silver shipments funded wars, court expenditures, and an expanding administrative state. Rather than invest heavily in domestic productivity, Spain relied on imported goods purchased with precious metals. Manufacturing declined at home while consumption surged. Wealth passed through the empire, but little of it took root. As obligations grew, the crown increasingly borrowed against future silver deliveries. Debt accumulated not because resources were scarce, but because spending outpaced productive capacity. When shipments were delayed or reduced, financial strain intensified immediately. To bridge the gap, the state resorted to repeated debt restructurings, effectively forcing creditors to accept losses in the name of stability. These were framed as temporary suspensions, necessary adjustments, and patriotic necessities. Each time, confidence returned briefly. Each time, the underlying imbalance worsened. Inflation surged across Europe as silver flooded markets. Prices rose faster than wages. The purchasing power of money declined, even as nominal wealth appeared to increase. Spain's dominance masked its vulnerability. The system felt strong because it was large, not because it was resilient. Denial played a central role. Policymakers insisted that external factors, wars, piracy, logistics, were responsible for financial stress. Structural dependence on imported goods and debt-financed spending was treated as a secondary concern. The belief that this time is different rested on the assumption that global reach and monetary abundance could override basic economic constraints. Eventually, the pattern asserted itself. Creditors demanded higher returns or withdrew entirely. Domestic industries withered. The state's ability to project power declined alongside its fiscal credibility. Spain remained a political entity, but its economic centrality faded. What had once seemed like an endless flow of wealth revealed itself as a temporary distortion. The stages repeated with remarkable precision: expansion, debt accumulation, monetary distortion, denial, and forced adjustment. The outcome was not sudden ruin, but prolonged decline. A system built on confidence learned that confidence cannot substitute for productive balance, and once trust in financial arrangements erodes, it rarely returns in the same form. The modern financial system operates on principles far more complex than those of ancient empires, yet it is governed by the same underlying forces. Today's system is global, digitized, and deeply interconnected. Money moves at the speed of networks rather than caravans. Risk is modeled, sliced, insured, and redistributed. But beneath this sophistication lies a familiar structure, a system dependent on confidence, leverage, and the assumption that obligations can always be met. In the contemporary banking framework, deposits are no longer treated as static holdings. They are liabilities on a bank's balance sheet used to support lending, trading, and investment activities. This is not hidden. It is foundational. Banks do not store deposits in isolation. They deploy them. Under normal conditions, this arrangement appears stable because withdrawals are predictable and trust remains intact. The modern innovation lies in how failure is addressed. After successive financial crises, policymakers concluded that taxpayer-funded bailouts created moral hazard. The solution was not to eliminate risk, but to reassign it. Legal frameworks were developed to ensure that when large institutions fail, losses are absorbed internally. Equity holders first, bondholders next, and under certain conditions, uninsured depositors. This mechanism is often described as a resolution process. It is designed to preserve institutional continuity while imposing losses on those deemed capable of bearing them. Deposits above insurance thresholds are no longer viewed solely as money held in trust, but as potential capital buffers. In extreme scenarios, they can be converted into equity to recapitalize a failing bank. The depositor becomes a shareholder not by choice, but by necessity. The rationale is straightforward. If a bank's liabilities exceed its assets, the gap must be closed. Governments are reluctant to intervene directly. Markets cannot absorb the shock instantly. Deposits represent a concentrated pool of funds already inside the system. From a structural perspective, they are the most accessible solution. This is not a prediction. It is a design feature. The rules exist because they have been written, tested, and, in some cases, quietly rehearsed. They are framed as safeguards to prevent broader collapse. Yet they rely on a subtle shift in perception, that money placed within the banking system participates in the system's risk, whether acknowledged or not. As in earlier eras, the system functions smoothly until confidence weakens. When incentives align, stability persists. When they break, the mechanisms that were meant to protect the system are activated. And at that moment, the distinction between saver and investor becomes less clear than most people assume. Late-stage systems are often at their most convincing just before they begin to fracture. Stability becomes a performance, reinforced by statistics, assurances, and carefully managed expectations. Institutions emphasize resilience, stress tests, and contingency planning. Markets respond not to fundamentals alone, but to signals of control. Volatility is interpreted as temporary. Structural weakness is reframed as adaptability. This is the acceleration phase, where deterioration speeds up precisely because it is denied. Risk does not disappear, it is normalized. Practices once reserved for emergencies become embedded in routine operations. Balance sheets grow more complex, less transparent, and more difficult to unwind without consequence. Interdependence increases. No single institution can fail cleanly without affecting others, which strengthens the argument that none can be allowed to fail at all. Narratives play a critical role. Language is refined to reduce alarm. Liquidity issues are described as technical. Solvency concerns are deferred. Confidence is treated as a variable that can be managed through communication rather than earned through structural repair. Those who raise concerns are dismissed as misunderstanding the system's sophistication or underestimating its safeguards. At this stage, warning signs are not hidden. They are visible but reinterpreted. Rising leverage is justified as efficiency. Compressed margins are explained as competitive pressure. Extraordinary interventions are labeled prudent oversight. Each adjustment appears incremental, even as the cumulative effect becomes irreversible. Action is delayed because delay feels safer than disruption. The cost of early correction is politically and socially unacceptable. The cost of inaction is abstract and distributed. Institutions choose the path that preserves immediate stability, even if it amplifies long-term risk. By the time decisive action becomes unavoidable, the range of options has narrowed dramatically. When acceleration finally becomes apparent, it feels sudden only because the groundwork was laid over years. Confidence shifts quickly, liquidity evaporates faster than models anticipate. Mechanisms designed to contain failure are deployed under conditions far more severe than those they were calibrated for. What follows is not panic, but enforcement. Rules are applied, losses are allocated. The system continues to function, but on altered terms. This is the point at which participation becomes compulsory. Not through force, but through structure. The architecture of the system ensures that those within it absorb the consequences of its survival. And by the time this becomes clear, the choice to exit has largely passed. History does not repeat because individuals fail to learn. It repeats because systems reward certain behaviors and penalize others, regardless of intention. When incentives favor expansion over resilience, leverage over productivity, and continuity over correction, outcomes converge. Each generation believes its tools are more advanced, its knowledge more complete, and each eventually discovers that structure matters more than sophistication. Financial systems are reflections of collective trust. They function not because they are flawless, but because participants believe the rules will hold. When those rules are quietly altered under stress, trust does not vanish instantly. It erodes. People adapt. They comply. Life continues. But something fundamental changes in how value is perceived and stored. The conversion of deposits into instruments of stabilization is not an anomaly. It is a logical extension of a system designed to preserve itself. From the perspective of institutions, it is rational. From the perspective of history, it is familiar. Ownership becomes conditional when survival is prioritized above all else. This does not require villains. It requires alignment. Policymakers act to prevent immediate collapse. Institutions act to maintain solvency. Participants act to protect what they can. Each response is understandable. Together, they produce outcomes that feel inevitable in retrospect. The persistence of these cycles reveals a deeper truth about human organization. We build systems to reduce uncertainty, then extend them until they generate it. We rely on rules, then modify them when they become inconvenient. We seek stability, then sacrifice the foundations that made it possible. Understanding this pattern does not grant immunity. Awareness does not exempt participation, but it does offer clarity. History's value lies not in prediction, but in recognition, in seeing that what feels unprecedented is often procedural, that what is framed as emergency is frequently structural, and that the most consequential changes are rarely announced. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.